Hello, and welcome to another session on Azure Stack. This is Platform as a Service with Microsoft Azure Stack. In particular, we'll look at the App Service Resource Provider in Microsoft Azure Stack, what it is and how it works. I have another shortcut for you at aka.ms/azurestack/app-services, where you can find lots of valuable information about the deployment process. For our agenda, this is what we'll talk about. First, what is App Services? In particular, how App Service is different on Azure Stack. We'll take a look at the architecture, kind of under the hood of the car a little bit. We can talk about administration scenarios, and also we'll take finally a look at the developer experience. So what is App Service? Azure App Service on Azure Stack is a platform as a service or PaaS offering on Microsoft Azure, but available to Azure Stack. It enables the creation of web apps, API apps, and Azure functions for any platform or device. Azure Stack Cloud operators can run customer apps on fully managed virtual machines with their choice of shared VM resources or dedicated virtual machines. App Service offers several app types, each of which is intended to host a specific workload. We have web apps, which are for traditional hosting of websites and web applications, and also API apps of hosting RESTful APIs. And then finally, Azure Functions for hosting event-driven serverless workloads. I'd like to give another example that I did share in the overview in case you missed that about API apps, because this is the one area that I find most customers are least familiar with. So I'll give you one of the two scenarios I've talked about in other sessions. Imagine you go to the doctor, they give you a prescription, you take that prescription to the drugstore. They then read that, they have to fulfill that order. In order to do that, they have to verify that you were at the doctor's and the doctor did prescribe it, even though you have a piece of paper. So they have an approval process that goes between the drugstore to the medical office, and that confirmation then goes back to the drugstore. So that may happen before you get there or during the time you get there. One customer that I work with, that was their whole business, was that interaction between the doctor offices and the major pharmacies in the United States. All that communication happens through API calls, and that is their secret sauce. So very interesting world. Didn't see much of it, 5 years ago when I started doing a lot of Azure, but in the last 2 to 3 years, seen much more of that starting to pick up speed. App Server and Azure Public Cloud case studies. So the reason why we're taking a look at this, because these have been well documented. We have case studies on various services, and the capabilities of what we're going to look at in particular for Azure Stack with App Services are some good case studies that have been written up and documented in public Azure. So let's take a look at a couple of these. So in this one, we have Iberia Express. And the objective was to create a scalable e-commerce site to sell flights both through travel agencies and directly to customers. So the key points about this is that whether we're doing business to consumer or business to business, app innovation is really changing the world. Every company is a software company now, as many people at Microsoft say, because if you don't have the software, you're going to lack the innovation and agility to bring things to market faster, cheaper, better, which we see that in a lot of industries that have been totally overturned just because of a little application. One simple app that we can all think about is Uber or Lyft, what that has done to transform the taxi business, right? Or remember the days when we had Blockbuster and now everyone uses Netflix in the United States to watch their movies. These have radically changed our world, and these are web apps. So brands like Iberia use apps to let consumers stream movies, shop for houses, order a cup of coffee. It's all absolutely amazing. But then there's companies like Skanska. The company is using apps to safeguard patients during disruptive construction projects that are close to hospitals. The Insight Monitor project came about when Skanska was working on a site near a neonatal clinic, and it was imperative that they capture all data on noise, dust amounts, fume readings, drilling times, and so they wouldn't cause vibrations, disrupting surgeries or sensitive neonatal equipment. Prior to that, people would have to monitor these things hourly, but now it all happens automatically. The next step was taking all that data and pushing it out to the cloud where a mobile application could access it. So think about an example where we have hybrid applications that we've talked about in the past, whether we're talking about airlines or neonatal equipment. We can have the Azure Stack in a local resident place with low latency and maybe data regulations that allow to be in that country where an Azure data center may not live. It can collect and assimilate all that information, and then if it needs to do other services, we can have a hybrid application where that information then can be ported over from the Azure Stack into the public cloud. And in this case, in this example, a mobile app was designed to do exactly just that. For all these scenarios, we can have single sign-on that lets the right people access the data in an easy way, from whether it's construction personnel to hospital staff, or in this picture, it could be flight attendants or people on the ground, or to customers using their phone on the airplane. So these are all great examples of traditional on-premises Fortune 500 enterprises that are using both operational legacy systems in the back end, think about the airlines, about all that they have there, as well as innovative, engaging, lightweight applications on the front end, the app services, to create entirely new experiences and to meet the business demands. And as a service provider of services to our customers, whether they're internal or external, that is our job, is to help the customer see and or explore what's possible. This is just another one I'll just briefly highlight, but in the United States and a lot of places around the world, everyone loves NASCAR. And the objectives were to support live video with live timing and scoring, and have a custom experience per manufacturer and support any device at large scale. So in order to do this, they had a combination of Azure services like storage, SQL, Notification Hub, and cache. And then for the front end, they would use an Azure web app running PHP as a front end. And to deploy all this, they would incorporate Azure DevOps. So as a result, you have a highly scalable web and mobile solution for streaming and live scoring in pretty much real-time information. And also, by having this exciting app, which people love their phones and they love their apps, it's very engaging to customers to interact with the application while reaching millions of users. So these are a few case studies that are out there to imagine what's possible. This is a big slide with a lot of information. We tried to narrow it down, but everything that's on here is what is available in Azure for web apps. The items highlighted in blue are specific to Azure Stack. So just briefly, we'll touch upon these. We have scheduled backup. We have Azure Active Directory integration, web jobs, role-based access control. We've talked about that in other sessions so that we can control who can access what and how with either owner, contributor, or reader rights. We support client certs, cache, IP restrictions, SSL, WebSockets, SQL, MySQL. A key point about that, actually in the bottom left-hand corner there, you note it says sticky sessions. And so integration with Azure Public is with Azure SQL DB and Azure MySQL DB. But in Azure Stack, this is where the architecture is a little bit different. There is no direct integration with the Stack SQL and the MySQL RPs. During the installation configuration, the app services actually has its own dedicated SQL server and dedicated file servers for that. And in our overview session about platform as a services, we talked about very important note that's worth bringing up again that you're very clear on is if we do app services and we do SQL services, each of those have to have their own dedicated SQL server. In other words, you cannot share a SQL server between two different resource providers in Azure Stack. And the reason why is that the resource provider takes full control over that. Some other quick things here, and again, you can read the slide, but fully managed platform, automated deployment, built-in load balancing, app gallery, wildcard support, HTTP compression, and also it's built for DevOps. So one of the favorite features a lot of people like in app services is site staging slots. So you can do swapping the slots, which is pretty cool. So you can have, it's almost like different little partitions of apps where you can have dev, test, QA, prod, and as you develop and test and stage, you can literally flip a switch and in real time move that application from those various pre-production environments. We can also do our CI/CD pipeline and have in the back end various back end stores. We'll talk more about those later. Site extensions gallery, lots of languages supported. Browser-based editing, auto-healing, logging, and auditing, and we have an admin site which we'll show you. So now that we've looked at the overview of app services in general with some great case studies, examples in the real world, and also looking at the subset, let's drill down a little bit more about app services on Azure Stack. So first, let's start with an app service plan. This is kind of a core concept. And an app service plan represents a set of features and capacity that you can share across multiple apps, again, which will include in Azure Stack, web apps and API apps or Azure functions in Azure Stack App Service. So we can have shared workers that have high density, multiple tenant apps, but there's only one tier enabled by default. Unlike in Azure, we cannot have small, medium, and large shared. We can't have dedicated workers also, which would be used by only one tenant. So again, tenant being the customer in the user space, that customer could have a dedicated worker for themselves, which could be small, medium, or large. And we can define multiple sets. And then the cloud admin can create custom SKUs and worker tiers for them. So if you saw the offers, plans, and quotas session, we talked about making add-on plans. So the way we could do this, we could have a custom SKU, we could have it as part of an add-on plan for that customer to be able to access these things. So worker tiers. So a worker tier is just it's a description for the web workers that host applications within Azure Stack, and they have specific characteristics. For example, a worker tier will serve a custom SKU. In App Service on Azure Stack, they can be customized for custom workloads, and we can scale up with worker tiers, and we have both free and shared worker tiers are supported by default. If we want to add additional tiers, we have to add more worker roles, and that is well documented on our Azure Stack documentation. You can do a search for Azure Stack App Service, add more worker roles, and it will walk you through the process. And to do this, actually across most all the roles, you do that by increasing scale set instances. Azure Functions. So this is serverless code. This is pretty cool stuff. It is just making and composing cloud apps just in a very easy fashion. Don't have to worry about servers, don't have to worry about infrastructure at all. You send the code up, get an answer back. You can develop functions in almost any of your favorite languages, C#, F#, Python, Batch, PHP, a whole bunch more. And easily schedule event-driven tasks across services. It exposes functions as HTTP API endpoints. And We can scale functions based upon customer demand. These can very easily integrate with logic apps, and that's a very common approach. However, again, just a reminder, logic apps does not exist on Azure Stack, but we could integrate it with logic apps in public Azure. So now let's take a minute and break down and take a look at the Azure Stack architecture. This is just a quick picture. We'll drill down a little bit later about all the various components. But just real quickly, the controller, the file server, the management roles, the front end, the publisher, and the worker roles. So let's talk about these here a little bit more. The default deployment. So at a minimum, we want to have 2 controllers, 2 management roles, 2 front ends, 2 publishers, and 2 shared workers. As we've mentioned in other sessions for the file server and SQL server, in production environment, they're highly recommended and I would say required to be deployed in HA configurations. If you, as a customer providing services, wish to deploy Azure Stack, the license cost is covered in the cost of the resource provider as long as the resources are deployed in the default provider description and they are only used by Azure App Service on Azure Stack. This is different, again, as another reminder, compared to SQL Resource Provider and MySQL Resource Provider. In those cases, those do require licensing, and those resource providers, the servers themselves, must be installed in a tenant subscription, which you, as an Azure Stack provider, can own that subscription and install them there. But in this case, you can deploy them right in the default provider subscription. So let's take a look at the Azure site. Let's take a look at the Azure Stack architecture site creation flow. So first of all, down the lower left-hand side, just follow the red arrows. The tenant creates a site via the Azure Stack portal. And when that happens, an ARM request is made. That request will be forwarded to the App Service Resource Provider API on the management role. Then the management role receives the request and it creates the site in the hosting database. Then it creates the content in a content directory in the file servers. Okay. And next, we can publish site content. So in order to do that, we can use an FTP server. So the customer starts to publish the content to the site via FTP. The publisher receives the connection. And then the FTP extension looks up the site's home path from the hosting database. Finally, the FTP session will be established, and then the user will proceed to upload the content to their site's home path. So let's look at the first request. So the user makes a request to the website or app. The front end receives the request, and then it will contact the data service on the management role. Then the data service retrieves the details from the hosting database and allocates the workers to the site if it's required. And then the front end can now route the traffic to the correct web workers, and the web workers will serve the request. So let's take a look at administration scenarios that we have. Deployment evolution. So this is still an evolution in progress. In the PaaS services overview, we talked about across the board for all the resource providers. This will be changing. We don't have timelines defined yet, but it is a work in progress where eventually all this will move to the marketplace. But in this example we're showing here, this is the application that's used to deploy app services. So there's several steps and scripts and an installer. So before we can get to this point, which is the easy part, you have to make sure that you follow all the prerequisites. So there's a website out there. I'm going to show you this one. I call it the Before You Begin, but it's actually Prerequisites for Deploying App Service on Azure Stack. So in the link I gave in the beginning, it's this link here, which is Deploy App Service in Azure Stack, which is kind of starting with the blue picture that we're looking at right here. Okay. But before we get to that blue picture, you've got a lot of homework, and you need to plan for this and make sure you do all these things. So I'm actually just going to use this page here to walk through, because this is what I show customers when I get in here. So first of all, you have to download the installer and helper scripts. And again, you have to take in consideration if you're in a connected or a disconnected scenario, because if you're in a disconnected scenario, in one customer I had, it was a connected environment, but we treated it like disconnected because the internet was just so bad and the connectivity was so bad. So what we did was we literally had a secured external hard drive where we would keep all of this stuff, our templates, our images from the offline marketplace syndication, where we download all those, all the scripts for SQL, MySQL, and app services. So you download these scripts, you download the app service installer, and you get all these various script files, which you're going to use. Also, it points out here, and this is interesting, that so Azure App Service on Azure Stack requires items to be downloaded from the Azure Marketplace, making them available. So you have to have those before. So you have to have the latest version of Windows Server 2016 Data Center virtual machine image, and also the custom script extension version 1.9.1 or greater. I just grabbed the latest one that's there, and that will be great. Getting certificates. So you have to get the Azure Resource Manager root certificate for Azure Stack. Now, maybe when the stack was first built and all these certificates were there, someone might have this tucked away, but I found out most customers I go to, they don't know where it is or they can't find it. So you can run this PowerShell command, get-Azure Stack root, and you can get that through the privileged endpoint, which we've talked about that in other sessions. So if you don't know how to use the PEP or privileged endpoint, we cover that in other sessions for you. So there's parameters in there for the privileged endpoint, the cloud admin credential. There's a default value here also. And in an Azure Stack integrated system, there's 3 possible options, ERCS 0, 1, 2, and 3. I always use the IP address just in case there's any DNS issues. And the way that we can get that, and this value could change if there's prefixes that were used or added in the deployment of Azure Stack. But again, I use the IP address, and I get that IP address and name by searching ERCS in the Azure Stack stamp info.json file, which the OEM who deployed your stack should have given you that. And again, if you didn't get that or can't find it, don't know where someone put it, that is something else you can generate or regenerate from the privileged endpoint. The Azure Stack Cloud Admin credential. So it's the Azure Stack /cloud admin. And again, this is a very special account that's kind of above and beyond, a little bit more secure. It should be treated more securely than just the owner of the subscription, because this is the account that unlocks the hood of the car into the privileged endpoint. So all these certificates here, these are 4 certificates that it needs. You cannot do one wildcard for all of them. You really need to do an individual certificate for each. And this is all well documented in the getting prepared for Azure Stack in the first place. So ideally, and in most situations, I don't think I've had a situation yet where these weren't pre-created during the deployment, because when the OEMs come out, they figure that, hey, you might need these in the future. So in addition to all the certificates that are required for Azure Stack itself, we're going to go ahead and get these done too. But if they're not, you can go through and do a search on. There's an article that talks about creating all that, and so they even give steps here for creating those. And then they walk through, and then here. So let me clarify what I said before. So they can be wildcard, but you can't have wildcard to cover all the subdomains. So so in this case, the three wildcards can be a star.appservice, star.scm, and star.sso. You can do those. So just walk through this very, very carefully when you're doing your certificates to make sure you get these. This one, I'm pretty sure that's, yeah, so then there's also there's the app service, the SCM, and then we have API and FTP, publishing certificates, and identity certificate. Also, for anything that you do, it's always good to do kind of validation. So we can validate, before you ever do a resource provider install, I think it's always good to do a test-Azure Stack just to make sure green lights are go. And that just kind of runs through and gives you, this is okay, this is okay. Walking through that's always a good best practice before you do some major change, like installing a major resource provider or a major update. Whenever you do your updates, you should do a test-Azure Stack before and after. Okay. So the virtual network, the wizard will build it all by itself. Also, if you do we've talked about in the PaaS service overview, and actually in the ARM templates session, there is a built-in file that will build out the file servers and SQL servers in an HA configuration. And that's really nice because when that template's run, it will make these subnets exactly right. So the one thing that they don't show you in here, the template takes care of, but if you did this manually, you need to be aware, if you have the file server and SQL server on stack with all the other components, they need to be in another subnet in this same virtual network that you create for these so that they can talk to each other. Because you could put them in a different virtual network, but two virtual networks by default don't talk to each other. So you would have to provide connectivity for them. It's just much easier because all subnets by default do talk to each other within a virtual network unless you restrict access. So that's kind of a recommendation we like to do. Licensing concerns, so we talked about that. If we do, the infrastructure deployed in the default provider, you're covered, and we don't have to worry about that. There are steps for preparing the file server and for preparing the SQL server. Again, if you use that script, it's beautiful. It does all this work for you. Now, where these steps will be important, because we mentioned you can deploy the file server off stack and the SQL server off stack, provided they're dedicated for this purpose, then you would have to go through all these things. You have to create global security groups, service accounts, file shares, content shares, all this sort of stuff. So again, if you get the template, you're good. You don't need to do this, but otherwise follow through this very, very well. And SQL, likewise, if you do things, there's specific information about it must be configured to support mixed mode because it does not support Windows authentication. So I think this is probably one of the most important single pages you really have to read every little bit here. Create an Azure Active Directory app. So this is the case. I was just talking with a customer the other day, and they had just finished deployment of an Azure Stack, and they had deleted the Azure AD Global Admin that was used. And we said, well, you're going to need that again. So whenever you do any major resource provider, a lot of times there's a service principal. When in order to create an Azure Active Directory service principal, that is an Azure, not an Azure Stack account. It's an Azure Global Administrator account that's required, in this case, to create the service principal. support the operations for scale set integration for tiers and SSO to Azure Functions and advanced developer tools. So what I recommend to customers to do is, a lot of people don't want Bob to give up and use his global admin account. So create a separate Azure AD global account. Of course, hopefully you did this before you start Azure Stack, and use that to create everything. Another safety tip related to the customer conversation the other day was something else they did was at the deployment, they used the Azure AD admin account and they deleted it, and they didn't then create an account as a subscription owner in the default provider subscription. So they were pretty much locked out. So that's a lesson learned. Hopefully that doesn't happen to you. But when you have a brand new stack, before you disable that Azure AD Global Admin, make sure that you or someone as an Azure Stack operator is an owner in that default provider subscription in the Azure Stack operator portal. And there's instructions how to do that. And then again, once you're done with initial deployment, disable that account because you're going to need it again for app service. And also, if you do major changes to the resource providers, you may need it as well. Okay. So it gives you all the parameters to file in here, and it walks through if you're in a disconnected or you're using ADFS, there's other steps you have to follow through. Once you've done all of that, which is going to take some time to get everything together, now we can get to this easy to click through blue box to deploy app service or upgrade to the latest version. Again, a note about the upgrade. These don't happen real frequently. Just only happen a couple times since Azure Stack came out. But the note is these kind of will follow along with total Azure Stack updates. So make sure you read the documentation. If a new update comes out for Azure Stack App Service, it will usually say minimum version is 1904 or whatever. And so you want to make sure that you fully updated, patched your Azure Stack to the minimum required version, and also have done that test-Azure Stack command to make sure all green lights are a go before you move ahead. There was one other related thing I didn't mention, but I did see it as I was flipping through that page related to the certificates. Even if you had your certificates before, there is a validation check on the certificates because maybe they were old or bad and no one ran that script. So you want to make sure you do the validation of the certificates also before you move forward, because that will be a hiccup in the deployment process. Okay. So we can monitor and troubleshoot the deployment. There's information in the portal that will tell you as a resource group deployment view, and actually in that documentation, aka.ms/Azure Stack/app service, it will tell you what to look for. There's also Azure Stack logs from the script host extension logs. And then on each VM, there is a status that will give detailed information if you need to walk through that. Also, there are role logs on the App Service Resource Provider Administration. There's another view of logs on Web Cloud Management Console on the controller. And there's event logs on each role for application and service logs and Microsoft. But if you get to that point where we really had that many difficulties, you're probably going to be entering a support call, because to get to all these logs and roles in the various places, it's sometimes just quicker to call support, unless you've been there, done that before. But generally, it's not something that has to be parsed through a lot. So I would say run the wizard, and actually you can, if it fails, sometimes you can rerun the wizard again, but you'll get output in the wizard. It will say, this didn't pass, or the certificates didn't pass. So whenever I've run into hiccups like that, it's been pretty self-explanatory. It's very rare that I've ever had to dig down in these logs. And if I did, the support people, they're very fast and efficient at doing that. So custom worker tiers, this gives administrators the ability to deploy custom workloads. So things like offering internal assemblies, non-core applications, maybe they need Go or Ruby, components not shipped in a box like Oracle clients. So we can create those also if we want to. Also, we'd mentioned in another session that Kudo is available. It's a tool for developers. And when you look at the URL, that was a hint that helped me to really understand what it was, because I was like, what is that? SCM. And then it hit me. That's source control management, right? So there's various information. There's a whole wiki. If people have been doing app services in Azure, it's a very similar look and feel for source control management and configuring all these things through REST APIs. So very developer-friendly tools. So sizing your app service. So there are a number and size of VMs for each role. Now, please do note this picture is the minimum requirements. They've been increasing these a little bit lately, so you want to check in the documentation where we probably should set these. But if you're just starting off, maybe in a dev test environment or a smaller environment, and you don't think you're going to do a lot, this will probably do okay. But this is, again, we've talked about minimums. You have to be careful about those. So pretty much you need to have 2 of each of these for the various roles for HA, right, for high availability. And we can also create dedicated workers and adjust those using configuration of worker tiers and SKUs. So there's a whole set of documentation on what you want to do and how you should do it for Azure Stack App Service capacity. I dug up the documentation on the latest guidance and wanted to show you where this was at for high availability recommendations above and beyond having just 2 servers for each. So on the left-hand side, you see here the article is actually called Deploy App Services for High Availability. It's pretty far down this page, but so their recommendations are for the controller role now 2, for the management publisher and front end 3 servers, and the shared worker role 10, and they actually show that on here. So that is moving forward probably the best recommendation, and the last few deployments, that's exactly how I've configured it. So wanted to share that with you. App Service on Azure Stack also supports on-demand deployments from multiple source control providers. This feature lets app developers deploy direct from their source control repositories. If users want to configure app service to connect to the repositories, a cloud operator must first configure the integration between app service on Azure Stack and the related source control providers. In addition to the local Git, the following source control providers are also supported: GitHub, Bitbucket, OneDrive, and Dropbox. In this slide, we show what it looks like after app services have been deployed in the user portal. So it's a very familiar experience like you would see in Azure, where we can do resource management and monitoring. And when we look down the center blade, we see all the things from activity logs to access control, tags, quick starts, deployment credentials, the deployment slots we talked about, deployment options, application settings, authentication, authorization, leveraging a managed service identity, backups, custom domains, scale up, scale out. So very familiar user experience in the Azure Stack user portal that they would be familiar with in public Azure. Just to recap on the tooling consistency, again, familiar tools that we have in public Azure. We can leverage Visual Studio to publish the app service both to Azure and Azure Stack, which is great if we have a hybrid application where maybe the web app lives on app service in the Azure Stack, but the mobile app lives in public Azure. Leveraging Cloud Explorer, PowerShell, CLI, Kudo, as we talked about. These are all tooling consistency across app services in Azure Stack. And when we're using Visual Studio to connect to Azure Stack, we can use it to write and deploy Azure Resource Manager templates to Azure Stack. So again, a reminder on that, our best source of truth to make sure that templates will work with the correct APIs and all the artifacts, it's always best to start with Azure Stack Quick Start templates. first, and then you can take those and modify them. Otherwise, if you take your own or you take something from Azure, it's going to take quite a bit more massaging. You can still make it work, but the Azure Stack Quick Starts have a lot of scenarios that you'd want to leverage from within Visual Studio. Within Visual Studio, when we're connected to Azure Stack, again, a familiar experience of connecting to the cloud. We can actually drill down. You notice on the left-hand side, we see that we're connected to Azure Stack. We have the app service plans. We can see availability sets, storage accounts, virtual machines, all this sort of stuff. And then we get down to web apps, where we see the deployment slots, the files, log files, web jobs. So very, very familiar experience, very easy to use. I myself, I'm not much of a coder, but I still like the experience with Visual Studio because it gives me a clearer view of the hierarchy of how things work to drill down through that. Also, with Kudo, we mentioned we have a built-in browser code editor where we can do this right from inside the Azure Stack portal, which is pretty cool. And again, this is for the source control management and for APIs. This is all accessible from the tenant portal or the user side. There you have it, folks. That's an overview of app services on Azure Stack. I hope you found this information useful, as well as the related resource links. I want to thank you for your time. This is Mark from Microsoft. Have a great day. Goodbye.